Hi, everybody. We're going to talk today about Community Ownership Governance 101. I'm Saki Bailey, the Executive Director of San Francisco Community Land Trust. I have 15 years of experience in this field. I'm an attorney. I've worked in policy. I've also done research and written books about real estate. So hopefully I'm going to be able to take you through some of the aspects of community ownership governance in a step-by-step way that's going to be understandable and accessible for everyone. Just a little disclaimer, this session is presented for informational and education purposes only. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here are those of me, the presenter, do not necessarily reflect the views of San Francisco Community Land Trust, and the information provided is for educational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional advice. Just had to say that, get the legal disclaimers out of the way so we can get on to the good stuff. San Francisco Community Land Trust, a little bit about us. San Francisco Community Land Trust was formed in 2003. We've been around for over 20 years now. We own 16 buildings, 180 units of permanently affordable housing, and all in San Francisco. We also lend technical support to other community land trusts and small developers across the Bay Area. A couple of years ago, San Francisco Community Land Trust received a very large $20 million grant from Mackenzie Scott. And through those funds, we've been able to not only scale and grow our own organization, but to also grow the ecosystem. So we convened 2 years ago a cohort of 15 community land trusts representing 6 Bay Area counties who are all working together and sharing resources so that we can uplift the community land trust movement as a whole. What is this video for? We are in partnership currently with the County of Marin, and we are planning on convening a steering committee in relation to the Community Land Trust Network project. This was a project created by the county to think through preservation and anti-displacement and a community land trust strategy for the County of Marin. And the purpose of this video is to provide you as a steering committee member or a member of the public with information about community land trust governance and what that's all about. Things we're going to cover in this video. We're going to cover community land trust governance. We're going to cover limited equity housing cooperative governance. You're going to have to forgive me for all the acronyms, but I'm just going to get them out front. So that when we go through this, you're not getting confused. So CLTs and LEHCs, I'm going to use that often throughout this video, are 2 forms of community ownership. They're different forms of community ownership, and I'm going to talk about the differences underlying these 2 things. But what they have in common is that they're both pursuing the democratic governance and creation of permanently affordable housing, all under what we're going to call preservation strategy. It doesn't have to be a preservation strategy, and you probably heard about this if you saw the video by our policy director, Kyle Sneely. There is also another P, the 3 Ps, so production, preservation, and protection. And community land trusts and limited equity housing cooperatives could actually be new builds, but we're going to think about them and talk about them in the context of the steering committee and in the context of this presentation, mostly as a preservation strategy. And just to repeat what that is, that's the acquisition and rehabilitation of existing housing stock and converting that into affordability right away from the get-go on day one. A phrase I'm going to use quite often throughout this video is agency through accountability and accountability through agreements. And why is this so important? Because both community land trusts and limited equity housing cooperatives, in their pursuit of creating permanently affordable housing in a democratic way, center residents. And we really are thinking here about resident agency. So what is that? It's the control over your life as a resident in a building to be able to control your housing future. But that doesn't come just as a privilege, it also comes as a duty. So that agency comes with accountability, and that accountability is created through agreements. And that's really what governance is, this the vague concept of governance. What is it? Is it law? Is it an agreement? Is it, practices? Is it an institution? It's a kind of all those things. But really, if we want to simplify it, we can just think of it as a set of agreements between me and you, between all of us, about how we're going to control and own housing together. Why community land trust? I'm not going to go through this in depth. I know this was covered again by my colleague Kyle Smealy, but just to refresh and reset as to why we're even talking about this at all. Why is this an interesting strategy? Well, because it has these benefits. It's going to increase permanently affordable housing, home ownership, and rentals in Marin County. It could develop and implement an anti-displacement strategy as part of that. And so what is that? Again, covered by my colleagues, so won't go into depth, but what we're doing is we're stopping displacement today. So people are being affected by the housing crisis. They're disappearing from the Bay Area, the communities we care about, the people of color, the people who serve our counties, the teachers, the service workers, the people who are on the front lines, working in hospitals, working for the county. All of those people are getting displaced. Why? Because it's so unaffordable to live in the Bay Area and to live in Marin. And we want to stop that displacement right away. And that's really what the anti-displacement preservation strategy is all about. And so that's preserving small to mid-sized properties and preventing displacement. Why do we say small to mid-sized properties? That's actually the majority housing stock in most of California is between 5 and 25 units. So when we're talking about intervening and preserving housing, we're talking about preserving those small 5 to 25 unit properties. What's another benefit of this strategy? We're going to support neighborhood businesses by keeping workers local. I know all of you know how awful it is when your favorite restaurant or your favorite small grocery store closes, or maybe it's a hair salon that closes because the workers there can't afford to live in the community and they're commuting from often very, very far away, and maybe they just can't do that anymore, or the local business can't afford the cost of actually have service workers because it's so unaffordable. It's so hard to get anyone to work in Marin that they disappear and those businesses disappear with them. It's also about ensuring community voice and control. So this is about doing development in a way that really integrates what the people in the neighborhood want with respect to housing development. Let's think about this together so that we're doing it in a way that respects the existing community and gives voice to that existing community. And we're also fostering local economies through these preservation opportunities. So the more that we keep the jobs and the people who are working those jobs here in our community, we're going to be fostering and supporting our local economy. So tons and tons of benefits. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of how hot the topic of community trusts are right now across this nation and in California especially. So, again, San Francisco Community Land Trust received this very large grant, but we weren't the only ones. Another land trust in Los Angeles, Trust South LA, also received a very sizable grant. Other land trusts in the area also received grants, and the Grounded Solutions Network, which is the national community land trust network, also received funding. And we're seeing exciting legislation popping up all over the place to support community land trusts. So there's legislation in New York City that is supporting land trusts and land trust acquisition of properties. There's a exciting social housing legislation that passed a couple of years ago that also promotes community land trust. So community land trust really being the prime example of what we call social housing. Social housing is housing, which is, again, same thing, permanently affordable, has a strong resident component, and that residents are able to control their housing futures. And so these are just some of the small ways in which community land trusts are showing up everywhere, and people are very excited about this strategy. I will just say, community land trusts, the strongest way in which community land trusts are showing up in legislation is in every single housing element across this state. Almost every single one of those housing elements has a community land trust component mentioned as part of its displacement strategy. So that's very interesting. We know that not all those jurisdictions have implemented a community land trust strategy, but it's very exciting to see that a lot of Bay Area cities already have community land trusts as an important aspect of their anti-displacement strategy in Berkeley and San Francisco and Oakland, and now in Marin. What is a community land trust? A community land trust is a 501c3 nonprofit that acquires and owns land for the long-term benefit of a community. Homes or apartments on the land are sold or rented at below market rate to ensure permanent affordability. Residents and community members make up 2/3 of the board and are centered in the board of directors. They help guide decisions and ensure permanent affordability, resident agency, and local control. So when we're talking about community land trust governance, what we're really talking about is all of that within the frame of a 501c3 nonprofit that is tax exempt, it has its IRS status as a charitable organization that also has its California incorporation as either a California public benefit or mutual benefit organization. And so that's the container. That's the container by which we then can talk about governance. Because why? Well, that nonprofit organization has a board. The board is really the one that's controlling who is working for the organization, how resources are allocated, and the decisions that they make. And in a community land trust 501c3, the properties that it's acquiring and the loan that they're taking on to support that development of housing. And again, highlighting here, wow, 2/3 of the board are actually made up of residents and people in the community. Amazing. That's not typical at all for a lot of 501c3 organizations, affordable housing organizations that are creating housing in our cities and counties. They're doing very important work. They may be creating permanent affordability. And what does that mean? It means affordability in perpetuity. So it means it's not just affordable for one generation of owners or one generation of renters, but it's going to continue to be affordable for future generations. As we know, when someone leaves a rent-controlled apartment, the next generation of renters, they don't get the same rent as that person who just left. Why? Because we don't have something in California, and no states really do, which is called a vacancy control, where the rent actually stays stable regardless of whether the person leaves. So the moment someone leaves a rent-controlled apartment, what happens is the rents go up, and the next person who's coming in is having to rent it at a high price that may be unaffordable to them. And that's kind of what we want to address is, okay, so rent control can't take care of everything. We, as a community land trust, are trying to present an alternative strategy, which is, okay, let's not only have rent control, which is very important. So protection, that's the 3 Ps that Kyle mentioned. Another very important aspect of housing development is protection. So those tenant protections to, make sure landlords aren't evicting people without just cause, making sure that your rents are not being increased beyond what's allowable by the rent board. But we also need, alongside that strategy, preservation. And preservation through the community land trust model means that we're not only going to stabilize your rent over time so it's affordable not only for that generation, the first generation of people who got in and got rent control, but then the second generation who's coming in. And so those rents are targeted at people of different area median incomes. And that's maybe another term that we are going to throw around a lot in the context of talking about the community land trust strategy. Why? Because in all affordable housing, we are trying to target people of specific incomes because we're trying to create that affordability today. So we're not waiting for the market supply to just solve the problem. Which, again, production, very important strategy. Build more housing, you increase supply. That means that prices will go down and eventually that strategy can work. But right now, people are being displaced. So we need that complementarity of the preservation strategy to say, let's not only build so that we can bring down prices and make sure people have housing choice, but we also can keep people in their communities and in their homes today. So that's the critical piece. So a lot of CDCs are doing permanent affordability, making sure that the rents are permanently affordable over time, but they're not necessarily centering residents and community members in their decision making like community land trusts. And that's what's so exciting about community land trusts. And I think why it's been mentioned in most of every housing element in California in the last round. How does a CLT work? So this was touched upon as well by my colleague. So I won't go deep into, the, let's say, policy or the principles behind how a community land trust works, but rather a little bit more technical into the governance, the legal part, the agreements that are made to support this kind of form of strategy. So land ownership, land that's permanently owned by community land trust. Well, it's not only permanently owned by the community land trust, but it's done so in a way that actually splits the ownership of the land from the ownership of the housing. And I will come to that in the next slide. And that's a very important thing because that's really what maintains the affordability. It creates affordable housing because it does so through that, again, the split in title, it's able to keep things permanently affordable. So let's say people own their home, but then they end up wanting to sell it eventually at market rate. Well, that can't happen because in a community land trust, the 501c3 would say, hey, wait a second, nope, sorry, homeowner, they own the home, the structure, but we own the land. And therefore, we need to come to an agreement that keeps this permanently affordable for the next generation. So if we can't do that, no, you can't sell it at that higher price. And that's a critical part of what also keeps it permanently affordable. And finally, then we have the community governance piece. That's where the board is guiding decision-making in the way that I talked about, with the 501c3 being made up of 2/3 community members and residents. So what structure that I just mentioned, it's often called the tripartite board. So community land trusts have a tripartite board. That's 1/3 residents, 1/3 community members, and 1/3, this is another group of members who are public members. And what are those public members? The public members are people who offer some form of technical expertise. And that might be in real estate development, it might be in law, it might be in finance. So these are skills that every community land trust needs to be able to assess some of the opportunities that are in front of them. Board members may also be very active in guiding the staff. They may even be staff people themselves in some very small organizations or some in a very early stage. And so all of that expertise really lends to the community land trust being able to make decisions and also to contribute to the development of housing. As I mentioned, trusts are serving people of certain area median incomes. And that target area median income is really people below 80% and up to 120%. The 80 to 120% are the moderate income folks. The people below 80% are considered the more low income folks. And then people, in the 30 and 40% range are kind of like the more very low area median income folks. And community land trusts are really serving all of them. They can also even serve up to 140%, so long as the person who is living in the property initially had an income that was below 80%. And that's just part of not wanting to punish people for economic mobility. We want people to have economic mobility. So great. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Different types of community land trust building ownership. We have lots of different forms of building ownership. We have limited equity housing cooperatives on community land trust land. We'll talk about that. So that's that acronym that I used at the beginning. And I will explain much more about what that is. But what we've been talking about thus far is really this ground lease concept. So this is the split in title between the land and the improvement. So it's where the land trust owns the land, the individual owns what we're called the improvement, which is really just the home, the structure of the home. And this is what's called the classic 99-year ground lease. Why 99 years? Well, it's just an interesting thing about the law in California and, well, throughout not only the United States, but the entire world, that property law really sees restraints on alienation as an anathema. What does that mean? It means that it doesn't like when we try to keep land permanently off the market. And so it requires us to do that in 99-year cycles, which are renewable. And that's why we call it the 99-year ground lease. So it's fully renewable. Somehow the law doesn't like it when you say forever. And so we call it 99 years. Another aspect of community land trust building ownership are the rentals. So there are permanently affordable rentals. There are also rentals that are self-managed co-ops. So they're like a limited equity housing cooperative in that they are a co-op, but they do not have any ownership component. So these are 4 different types of building ownership that exist commonly within a community land trust. Again, just refreshing on this idea of the split. This is just a visual so that you can imagine a little bit of what this looks like. So both the rental building and the home ownership building offer this permanent affordability, the ability to offer generations, every generation of homeowners, future and present, with affordability. And in a rental building, we do it by stabilizing the rents, ensuring that the rent is capped to a reasonable percentage, anywhere between 2 to 4%, and that the land is owned by the community land trust in both aspects of this. And in the homeownership, really that structure being owned by the homeowner or a group of homeowners, as we will see in a limited equity housing cooperative. The governance structure of a limited equity housing cooperative. Here is one. This is an example of our Columbus United Cooperative. This was our first project. I'll say more about that in a moment. The governance structure of Columbus United Cooperative works in the following way. SFCLT is that 501c3 nonprofit with that board, where 2/3 are residents and community members. And then we have what's called a 99-year master lease agreement with the cooperative. So that's that ground lease that I was talking about, where we own the land, and then the Columbus United Cooperative, which is their own board and their own nonprofit public benefit corporation, and actually it's a 501c4. They own the structure together collectively, and they have their own board. And that board is made up of members, and the members are residents in the building. You have to be a resident in the building to be able to participate on the board. Some co-ops have it that you can actually have outside members for whatever reason. Maybe you want advice from like experts in the housing field, or lawyers who maybe can provide assistance with conflict resolution or in creating future agreements. And so sometimes there will be this external aspect, but for the most part, all the board members need to be residents. And what does that mean? It means they all have occupancy agreements, right? So residents have occupancy agreements, which are very similar to a lease. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between occupancy agreements and kind of straightforward leases and a rental arrangement. Some of the relevant law in California, so this is just for the geeks who want to look a little bit deeper into this topic and are super excited. So everything is codified in the law in Civil Code 817. There are also aspects of the Business and Professions Code and the Health and Safety Code where limited equity housing cooperatives are mentioned. If you're looking into how to run an LEHC, you also fall under the Davis-Sterling Common Development Act. This applies to all common developments, including HOAs. Co-ops are like HOAs. I'm going to show you how they're a little different, but that's something else that you would need to look into to understand the regulation of LEHCs in California. You'd also be dealing with the subdivision lands law. And as I mentioned earlier, you would be incorporated as a California Public Benefit Corporation or mutual benefit corporation. And you can, in fact, also have an exempt IRS tax status so long as you're a 501c3 or 501c4, which means that 75% of your housing is dedicated to those below 80%. So in order to qualify, you need to demonstrate that you do, in fact, serve a charitable or public purpose. And here it's really to serve people of low income, and that's why you have to meet that threshold. What are the advantages of limited equity housing cooperatives over permanently affordable rental housing? Well, the biggest benefit is that individuals in a limited equity housing cooperative are owners. And so that means they are building equity for individuals while at the same time creating that permanently affordable asset for the community. There's kind of a tension or balance there between building equity and that permanent affordability. So community land trusts are really there to help strike that balance between what a resident wants or desires in terms of growing equity so that this home can also serve not only as a home, but a wealth building vehicle, which I think in the American context, that's really part of the whole American dream is this idea of building equity in your home, that being a home owner is kind of the ultimate form of not only security, but economic mobility because you're building that equity in your home. The opportunity to own a home for the first time is a really big benefit of the limited equity housing cooperative because for a lot of people, homeownership is completely out of reach. We know what it means to own a home in the Bay Area. It's a minimum of $1.4 million or $1 million at the least, right? Which means you've got to come up with the equity, which is like a minimum or the down payment, which is at least 200K potentially, right? A lot of people don't have 200K in the bank or they are just not able to offer to be able to get $1 million loan. And so this is the first stepping stone for a lot of people into home ownership is to own a community land trust property or specifically in a multi-unit context, a limited equity housing cooperative, to own their apartment in a multi-unit building at an affordable price. And I'll talk a little bit about the example of Columbus United Cooperative, where we're actually able to offer that opportunity at the tune of $10,000 in 2009 when we first started. And we're still able to offer that at the tune of $14,000 today. Now, that does mean, right, that the equity that accrued in that period for the residents was not much more than a kind of savings account. And so there's balances. There's a balance between that ability to build equity and at the same time you want it to keep it permanently affordable, as I mentioned earlier. So that's exactly where that balance happens. Now, you can have it actually appreciate more than 2 to 4%. But again, you just have to balance that concept of how affordable you want to make it for the next generation of owners. The ownership entitlements in your home in a limited equity housing cooperative are very much akin to regular home ownership in that it is an inheritable right. So you can pass your apartment on to your children. And that's a really big benefit of this model is that it's really offering, in addition to offering home ownership for people who would never have access to home ownership otherwise, you're also able to build wealth, family wealth, community wealth, and being able to pass it on to your children. Um, Another aspect of one of the benefits of limited equity housing cooperatives is that it's an opportunity to participate in self-governance. It's an opportunity to learn practical skills in housing maintenance and in the governance of a board of a housing organization. And that's exciting because when people know more about how their housing is maintained and created, they can have more control about the future of that housing and how affordable it stays. And that's, I think, a big part of why community land trusts are such an exciting and important aspect of any anti-displacement strategy. How does a housing co-op compare with other forms of housing? I'm trying to get at this in a few different ways because I know that the topic can be a little confusing. So, in a condo association, I think many of us are familiar with what a condo association is. Each individual owns a divided piece of the property. So you see these, three people with their three little distinct pieces of pie. They own all of those, distinct pieces of property separately. In a housing co-op, all members combined own an undivided share of the nonprofit. What does that mean? It means that they own the property together. So while in a condo, each of those homeowners went out and got their own loan, qualified for their own loan. Maybe they got a first-time home buyer's assistance, support in order to buy that property, but they had to go out and get their own loan, right? So they got underwritten. They had a credit assessment done on their own finances, individual finances. Here, no. In a co-op, you actually hold a blanket mortgage or a single loan together. And what does that mean? That means that actually people who may not have typically been approved for a loan on their own actually get to qualify collectively together. So there's this kind of, in a way, cross subsidization effect that happens in a co-op where maybe people who have really, better credit and more assets are able to assist people who don't necessarily have those assets or don't have that good credit to also own a home. In a rental apartment, we know what happens. Tenants own nothing. So these are two forms of ownership that are distinct in comparison to rental. By sharing the pie, individuals can benefit by being able to access ownership, which they couldn't on their own. However, tenant agency requires what I'm going to call good pie sharing. And this brings us back to what I started with at the beginning, which is that agency comes through accountability, and accountability comes through agreements, so governance, legal agreements. In other words, cooperation accountability between the land trust and the co-op and between the co-op and its residents, it has to be based on that type of concept of agency based on accountability based on agreements. Empowering tenants requires recognizing that freedom actually requires limits. So the ability to do something, the privilege you have to use your property, to do as you will with the property, also requires that you have a duty to respect others and their use of their property. And so not infringing on their quiet use and enjoyment of their property. And so all of that comes through agreements, building that accountability towards one another, those duties of property through agreement. Areas of accountability can be baked in to the structure of the organization. And this is done through legal agreements. And so in some ways, when we're talking about that 501c3 organization that has a board and the way that that's structured, that's baking in accountability into the structure of the organization. Why? Because we know that the organization has to have a board, right? Has to have that composition of the board that we mentioned. And the board is then responsible for certain things in relation to the organization. This is true not only at the community land trust board level, but it's going to be true at the co-op board level. And we're going to get into the specific agreements. So this pie sharing and this concept of agency through accountability and accountability through agreements, this is done through specific agreements between the land trust and the co-op. And what are those? One is called a master lease agreement. Another agreement, which is not necessarily a formal legal agreement, but absolutely has to be there, which is a roles and responsibilities agreement. This could take the form of a RACI. Some people are familiar with this concept of the way in which you divide roles and responsibilities between different groups. Sometimes it could also be a development agreement, and this takes place when maybe there are multiple parties in a transaction or owners of property. Like, for example, at Columbus United, we have the Asian Law Caucus as a commercial tenant. So there's a third party there. And so as a result, we have an additional agreement to kind of lay out the roles and responsibilities, not only between the land trust and the residents, but also that commercial tenant. Another aspect of the agreements is between the co-op and its members. So this is agreements that define the membership, the bylaws, the occupancy agreements, and we'll talk also about subscription agreements and membership certificates. So these are some of the examples we'll go through. As I mentioned, a lot of our understanding and experience around limited equity housing cooperatives comes from our first project of Columbus United Cooperative. I know that Kyle also spoke a little bit about the early organizing efforts there and how this project was created, so I won't talk about that. But what I will say is that this project not only achieved financial sustainability within 5 years, but during the pandemic, when so many other affordable housing projects were unable to pay their loans, had difficulty in collecting rents because, well, we're in the midst of a pandemic. A lot of people couldn't work and were unemployed. This property actually had zero in arrears. And this really goes to this really important and interesting thing about community land trust, which is that it's a really viable and successful model that's highly resilient, even under crisis, even during the pandemic. And finally, I'll say another critical aspect of the success story of this project really is about the capacity that the Community Land Trust builds into the limited equity housing cooperative and providing this board, this co-op, with technical assistance and all those things that I mentioned are part of usually the skill set of a community land trust board, people in real estate, people with law and finance backgrounds, the staff that has all of that expertise, and being able to really support the co-op board with all of those skills. So those lessons from Columbus United Cooperative, as I said, resilient even under crisis. I will say that a really interesting data point is that during the 2007-2009 foreclosure crisis, community land trust properties saw almost 0% default on any of their loans, which really kind of went against the common sense for a lot of people that, people of low income, they're really precarious and risky to lend to because who knows, maybe they will become unemployed and they just don't have as many assets. And so it's a much more risky proposition. Well, that data point just really threw that out the window, that in fact, people who live in land trust properties are very, very responsible. very much able to also afford the land trust property that they live in. And as a result, they actually are not defaulting on their loans. And they are not actually a risky proposition as previously believed. So I think all of that research and the articles that are out there that support this just really drive at how successful this model can be for people of low income to become homeowners for the first time. There's also a lot of research on community land trusts and limited equity housing cooperatives that supports that LEHCs on CLT land are more successful and in maintaining and sustaining their finances and continuing as a permanently affordable high quality building. Why? Because of that initial and ongoing technical support that I mentioned. Some of the relevant legal documents. So we're going to talk about the Articles of Incorporation and Bylaws, the Master Lease Agreement, the Occupancy Agreement, the Subscription Agreement and Membership Certificate, and the roles and responsibilities of the Land Trust versus the LEHC. So revisiting this a little bit, back to the governance structure, why is this important? What is this master lease? Well, the master lease is the agreement between the land trust and the board. It really is the way in which the board is that the board of the CLT is leasing out its the land to the board of the cooperative. So that's really where the master lease agreement comes in. And then the occupancy agreement, as I said, it's like the lease agreement, and there's just a few ways in which it's different. What are the bylaws? So the bylaws of an organization are like its constitution. So the articles of incorporation and the bylaws are like the constitution. It's laying out some important conceptual and functional relationship between members, but it's at a very high level, right? So it's going to do things like define the membership. So it's going to say who gets to live in this building. Maybe it's based on area median income. It's definitely not based on any grounds based on race, ethnicity, religion. Why? Because that's fair housing. And I'm not going to get into that because we have another video on that coming up. But that is certainly one way in which you can't define the membership is based on any of those grounds. But you can certainly do it based on income. You're also defining the leadership. So you're talking about who controls the organization. And that's really just generally the board of directors. You're also defining the membership interest and conditions for the transfer of membership interests. So all or substantially all members hold an exclusive right to occupancy in a portion of the real property. What does that mean? It means that people in a co-op own shares, and those shares represent their entitlement to live in the building, in their apartment. So the shares are what allow you to own that portion of the real property or your apartment. It also defines how membership interests at the time of sale are calculated and how interest is going to accrue. And it generally accrues on something like the consumer price index or the area median income, some index that is other than the market rate. Because why? Well, we don't want this building to fluctuate on the market, or it could become unaffordable. So using indexes like the consumer price index or the area median income are ways in which to do that. The master lease agreement. So remember, that was that agreement between the land trust and the co-op board. So the lessor, what's going to be referenced as the lessor in this agreement is the land trust. So in the case of Columbus United, it was San Francisco Community Land Trust. And then the lessee is the person that you're renting that or leasing that land to. And in this case, it's Columbus United Cooperative, the cooperative. The term of the lease is 99 years. Why? Again, it's just the way the law works in this funky way where we can't talk about forever. So we're going to talk about 99 years with an option to extend. And here, what's interesting is that the rent or carrying charge and what is covered, and all of the notice requirements for increases and formulate for increases. All of these things are laid out there. So in a limited equity housing cooperative, people don't pay rents. Why? Because they're homeowners, but they do pay for something called a carrying charge. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Excuse me. Um, I've been suffering from a little bit of a cold. So the carrying charge is what's going to cover all of the operating costs and expenses in relation to running the building. And that's kind of, if you want to think about it like an HOA fee or something like that, that's kind of what the carrying charge is. So it also lays out allowable uses and limits on uses. So that might have to do with common areas. If there's a commercial tenant, right, their rights to use their commercial unit in relation to the residential property. So it's going to lay out also terms around the transfer of the property. When can it be transferred? Under what conditions can it be transferred? It's going to lay out as well, like how maintenance and repair is taken care of, what kind of insurance requirements you need to maintain on the property. The also elaboration of the roles and responsibility around finance, asset management, property management. And in the case of CUC, this is also a property that has Mayor's Office of Housing Financing on it. And so there's also oversight or compliance over income eligibility. So there's income certifications that are done on the property. It also lays out the events of default. So these are usually the things that are contained within a master lease agreement. And usually events of default, they're related to default on the loans that are on the property, which if you are able to maintain successfully, you're ensuring the financial sustainability of the building as a good trust can do, these things won't happen. The occupancy and subscription agreements, the membership certificate. So the occupancy agreement, it is like a lease with the exception that a rent is a carrying charge, not rent per se. That it's also a lease, except you have to meet the affordability requirements. So it's not just like a standard lease in that way. You have to be able to income certify and demonstrate that you are within the affordability range that is intended by the property. It's also going to lay out, like a normal lease, the use of the premises in the individual and common areas. And it's going to have something different in it, which is a limitation on the transfer of the property subject to the co-op board approval and process. Why? Because again, it's ownership, but you can't just sell it whenever you want. Why? Well, you live in a multi-unit building that's collectively owned, and the co-op board is the one that's going to decide along with you who you're going to sell it to, right? So you're allowed to sell. You're allowed to leave when you want, to exit with the the principal that you put down as well as any appreciation, but you're not going to be able to do that without the co-op board approval and process. And in a context of limited equity housing cooperative, you're going to be doing it according to also the income requirements, right? So Columbus United Cooperative, year over year, they're targeting a very low area median income, which is fabulous because we're able to offer affordability to people of very low income who couldn't afford it otherwise. So they're doing it at 40% area median income, which is extremely low. Again, people at 40% area median income would never, ever have access to homeownership otherwise. The subscription agreement simply lays out the amount that was paid for the membership, just so that there's a record of like what was exactly paid as principal down and and so then we also understand how much is going to be paid out to the person when they move out. And the membership certificate is what outlines the rights and limitations of the tenant's use, exclusion, and transfer of the property. So similar to the occupancy agreement, but just keeping it in the form of a certificate, which really shows you are the owner of this apartment. And this is the portion of that property that you are able to use, exclude others from, and eventually transfer. So that's it. That was CLT governance and limited equity housing cooperative governance 101. If you are someone who is a super geek like I am, you may want to go to some additional resources to learn more. I've provided those here in the summary. So, California Community Land Trust Network, awesome, awesome resource. Love their work. I did also a lot of volunteer work for them in the past, working on policy, but California Community Land Trust Network, fabulous organization that represents all of the land trusts in the states. There's so many land trusts that are popping up everywhere. I think at this point, it's something like over 50 land trusts exist across the state of California. Gravity Solutions, another great resource. That's the National Community Land Trust Network. And so there's some great information there about how community land trust works. Other and Belonging Institute, love their work too, doing fabulous work, talking about how community land trusts are stewards of public land and the role of residents. I've also included some of the links to some of the things that I cited about, how LEHCs are more successful on CLT land. So those resources are there if you are a super geek and want to go deeper into this topic. I just want to say again, this central concept, which I feel like is what really defines this concept of governance: agency through accountability and accountability through agreements. So again, community land trusts, limited equity housing cooperatives, what do? They bake into their legal structure this ability of residents to participate and have agency over their housing futures. But this has to be done with accountability, and that accountability is built through the legal agreements. And I've had a chance to go through some of those with you. I hope you learned something, and looking forward to continuing to engage with you. Thank you.